The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of medieval Paris as young Thomas hurried through the narrow streets, his master's leather satchel of surgical instruments bouncing against his hip with each quick step. The year was 1537, and somewhere ahead, a merchant's wife lay dying from a difficult childbirth, while her husband paced frantically outside their cramped quarters above the bakery. Thomas's master, a grizzled barber surgeon named Guillaume, had been summoned in desperation. The university-trained physician had declared the case hopeless and departed with his fee, leaving the family to face their tragedy alone. If you use these videos to fall asleep, subscribe so you don't miss any new ones. Leave a comment with your thoughts on the video and any suggestions you have for future ones. This scene, repeated countless times across medieval Europe, captures the extraordinary world of the surgeon barber, a profession that existed at the intersection of the sacred and profane, where men who trimmed beards in the morning might save lives through desperate surgery by evening. For nearly 8 centuries, these remarkable practitioners served as the backbone of European medical care, wielding razors with equal skill. Whether grooming a noble's whiskers or amputating a soldier's gangrenous limb, their story is one of transformation, innovation, and human courage in the face of suffering. A tale that begins in the quiet corridors of monasteries and culminates on the blood-soaked battlefields that shaped medieval Europe. The world of the medieval barber surgeon was one where death lurked behind every procedure, where a steady hand and sharp blade could mean the difference between salvation and tragedy. Picture the drama of their daily existence. Dawn might find them carefully shaving the tonsures of monks in stone-walled monasteries, their movements precise and meditative in the candlelit silence. By midday, they could be in the chaotic marketplace, extracting infected teeth from screaming patients, while curious crowds gathered to watch. As evening approached, they might find themselves summoned to a nobleman's castle, where a hunting accident had left the lord's son with a compound fracture that would test every skill they possessed. This was a profession born of necessity and shaped by circumstance, where religious doctrine, practical need, and human ingenuity converged to create something entirely unprecedented in human history. The men who practiced this dual art were neither fully physicians nor simple tradesmen, but something altogether unique. Healers who worked with their hands, scholars who learned through blood and pain, and innovators who challenged medical orthodoxy through sheer empirical observation. Deep within the stone walls of the Abbey of Cluny, Brother Benedict carefully arranged his instruments in the pale light of dawn. The year was 1095, and the sound of morning prayers echoed through the corridors as he prepared for his daily rounds. In his weathered hands lay a collection of sharp implements that would seem familiar to any modern barber. Razors of varying sizes, small scissors, and whetstones for maintaining their edges. But Brother Benedict was no ordinary barber. He was about to participate in one of the most significant transformations in medieval European society, though he could never have imagined the far-reaching consequences of his simple daily tasks. The monastery where Brother Benedict worked buzzed with activity that went far beyond spiritual contemplation. These religious communities served as the hospitals, schools, and centers of learning for medieval Europe, drawing pilgrims, scholars, and sufferers from across the continent. Within their walls, the sick found refuge, the injured received treatment, and the dying found comfort in their final hours. The monks who tended these souls had inherited a medical tradition that stretched back to ancient Greece and Rome, preserved through the Dark Ages in their carefully copied manuscripts. Yet something was changing in the spiritual landscape of Europe, something that would forever alter the course of medical history. The Church, in its growing concern for the purity and sanctity of religious life, was beginning to question whether it was appropriate for men of God to shed blood, even in the service of healing. This theological concern would soon crystallize into a decree that would shake the foundations of medieval medicine and give birth to one of history's most remarkable professions. Brother Benedict's daily routine began before dawn with the ritual of preparing the tonsures for his fellow monks. The tonsure, that distinctive circular shaving of the crown of the head, was far more than a mere hairstyle. It was a sacred symbol of a monk's renunciation of worldly vanity and his dedication to spiritual life. The precise execution of this ritual required not only skill with a razor, but also a deep understanding of its religious significance. Each stroke of the blade was performed with reverence, transforming what might seem like a simple grooming task into an act of spiritual devotion. But the skills Brother Benedict had developed in maintaining tonsures proved invaluable beyond their original religious purpose. When pilgrims arrived at the monastery gates bearing wounds from their dangerous journeys, his steady hands and sharp instruments made him a natural assistant to the monks who provided medical care. When a fellow brother fell ill and required bloodletting, the most common medical treatment of the era, Brother Benedict's expertise with blades made him the obvious choice to make the necessary incisions. The transformation from religious barber to medical assistant happened gradually, almost imperceptibly. As Brother Benedict spent more time assisting with medical procedures, he began to absorb knowledge about anatomy, wound care, and the theoretical foundations of medieval medicine. He learned about the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, that medieval physicians believed governed human health. He discovered how different ailments required bloodletting from specific locations on the body, and how the phases of the moon and position of the stars influenced the timing and effectiveness of medical treatments. What made this transformation particularly significant was that Brother Benedict and his fellow monk barbers were developing practical, hands-on medical skills, while university-trained physicians remained largely theoretical in their approach. The physicians could quote Galen and Hippocrates in Latin, debate the finer points of humoral theory, and diagnose ailments with scholarly precision. But when it came to actually opening a vein, setting a bone, or removing an infected tooth, they relied on their monastic colleagues who had developed the manual dexterity and practical knowledge necessary for such tasks. The irony of this situation was not lost on contemporary observers. Here were humble monks, bound by vows of poverty and obedience, becoming some of the most skilled medical practitioners in Europe, while learned physicians with years of university education remained largely dependent on others to carry out their treatments. This paradox would soon become untenable as changing attitudes within the Church began to challenge the appropriateness of clerical involvement in procedures that necessarily involved the shedding of blood. The theological concerns that would ultimately transform medieval medicine had been brewing for decades. Church leaders increasingly questioned whether it was appropriate for men who had taken sacred vows to engage in activities that involved physical violence, even when performed for healing purposes. The act of making incisions, regardless of therapeutic intent, was seen as fundamentally incompatible with the peaceful, spiritual mission of monastic life. These concerns would culminate in a series of decrees that would forever alter the landscape of European medicine. When the papal decree of 1163 finally forbade monks from shedding blood, it sent shockwaves through monastery infirmaries across Europe. Suddenly, men like Brother Benedict found themselves at a crossroads. They could continue their religious vocations and abandon their medical practice, or they could leave the monastery and pursue their calling as healers in the secular world. Many chose the latter path, taking with them not only their practical skills, but also the medical knowledge they had acquired within monastery walls. The impact of this decision reverberated far beyond individual choices. The departure of skilled monk barbers from monasteries created a vacuum in medical care that needed to be filled. At the same time, it released into secular society a group of practitioners who possessed both technical skills and medical knowledge, a combination that would prove invaluable in the development of a new kind of medical professional. These men, no longer bound by monastic vows, were free to establish practices, take apprentices, and develop their skills in ways that had been impossible within the constraints of religious life. As Brother Benedict packed his instruments for the last time and prepared to leave the only life he had known, he could not have imagined that he was participating in one of the most significant professional transformations in European history. The skills he had developed in the service of God would soon be employed in service to humanity in an entirely new context, laying the foundation for a profession that would shape medical practice for centuries to come. The transformation of displaced monk barbers into secular medical practitioners did not happen overnight. As these men ventured into the bustling world beyond monastery walls, they discovered a society hungry for their services, but uncertain about their place within established social hierarchies. The story of how they adapted to this new world, established their practices, and eventually formed the guild structures that would govern their profession for centuries is one of remarkable entrepreneurship and social innovation. Consider the journey of Frère Antoine, who left the Abbey of Saint-Denis in 1170, carrying nothing but his razor case and a letter of recommendation from his abbot. Paris in the late 12th century was a city of perhaps 25,000 souls, crowded within ancient walls and growing rapidly as trade and commerce expanded throughout Europe. The narrow streets teemed with merchants, artisans, students from the emerging university, and pilgrims traveling to and from the great Cathedral of Notre Dame, then under construction. Into this dynamic environment stepped Antoine, seeking to establish himself as a practitioner of the medical arts while competing with established physicians and earning the trust of potential patients. The challenge facing Antoine and his fellow former monks was considerable. University-trained physicians enjoyed the prestige of classical education and the patronage of wealthy clients who could afford their services. These learned men diagnosed ailments in Latin, prescribed complex treatments based on ancient texts, and maintained strict social boundaries that separated them from those who worked with their hands. At the other end of the spectrum were simple craftsmen, leatherworkers, blacksmiths, carpenters, whose skills were respected, but whose social status remained decidedly modest. Antoine needed to carve out a niche between these established categories, creating a new kind of practice that drew on both his technical skills and his medical knowledge. His solution was ingenious in its simplicity. He would establish a shop that served multiple functions, providing both routine grooming services and medical treatments as circumstances demanded. This approach allowed him to build a regular clientele through barbering while demonstrating his medical capabilities to potential patients. The physical space that Antoine created became the prototype for thousands of similar establishments across Europe. His shop occupied the ground floor of a narrow building near the university quarter, its wide windows providing maximum daylight for delicate work. The distinctive red and white striped pole outside announced his services to literate and illiterate customers alike. Red symbolizing blood, white representing bandages, and the pole itself representing the staff that patients gripped during bloodletting procedures. Inside, the shop presented a fascinating blend of commercial establishment and medical facility. Comfortable chairs accommodated customers seeking haircuts and shaves, while a separate area contained the implements necessary for medical procedures. Shelves lined the walls, displaying an impressive array of instruments. Razors of various sizes, scissors, lancets for bloodletting, forceps for tooth extraction, and the specialized tools required for more complex surgical procedures. The careful maintenance and arrangement of these instruments served both practical and promotional purposes, demonstrating Antoine's professionalism while reassuring customers of his competence. The daily rhythm of Antoine's practice reflected the dual nature of his profession. Morning typically brought customers seeking grooming services, merchants preparing for business meetings, students wanting to look presentable for their masters, clergy requiring maintenance of their tonsures. These routine services provided steady income and opportunities to assess customers for potential medical problems that might require treatment. A customer complaining of headaches during a shave might be a candidate for bloodletting. Someone grimacing with dental pain could be scheduled for tooth extraction. Afternoons often brought more serious medical cases. Word of Antoine's skills spread through the close-knit community, and soon he was being called to treat injuries, perform surgical procedures, and provide medical care for those who could not afford university-trained physicians. The social dynamics of these interactions were complex, as Antoine needed to establish his authority and competence while maintaining appropriate deference to the social superiors among his clientele. The reputation that Antoine built was founded on practical results rather than theoretical knowledge. Unlike university physicians who might spend hours debating the precise nature of a patient's humoral imbalance, Antoine focused on treatments that produced visible improvements. His approach to bloodletting was informed by traditional theory, but modified by practical experience. He learned which techniques caused less pain, which locations healed most quickly, and which patients responded best to different approaches. As Antoine's practice grew, he faced the challenge of training assistants and eventually apprentices who could help with the increasing workload. The knowledge he needed to transmit was complex, encompassing not only technical skills but also the subtle art of patient interaction, the business aspects of running a medical practice, and the delicate social negotiations required to establish credibility with customers from different social classes. This training process would eventually evolve into the formal apprenticeship system that became the foundation of professional education for barber surgeons throughout Europe. The success of practitioners like Antoine attracted the attention of both supporters and critics. University-trained physicians viewed these new competitors with suspicion and hostility, arguing that men without classical education were unqualified to practice medicine. They petitioned authorities to restrict barber surgeon activities and complained bitterly about losing patients to practitioners they considered inferior. In 1254, the surgeon Bruno de Longobucco voiced the frustration of many university-trained colleagues when he wrote condemning barbers for performing medical procedures beyond their competence. However, the practical effectiveness of barber surgeon treatments and their accessibility to common people created a groundswell of popular support that proved impossible to suppress. Patients who had experienced relief from their treatments became advocates for the profession, while the growing commercial importance of cities made civic authorities reluctant to restrict practitioners who served the health needs of their populations. The resolution of these tensions came through the establishment of guild systems that provided formal recognition of the barber surgeon profession, while establishing standards for practice and training. The guild movement represented a remarkable social innovation, creating institutional structures that balance the interests of practitioners, patients, and civil authorities while providing pathways for professional development and social mobility. When King Edward II granted guild status to English barbers in 1308, he was not merely recognizing an existing profession, but helping to create a new model for medical practice that would influence healthcare delivery for centuries to come. The guild charter established barber surgeons as legitimate medical practitioners with rights and responsibilities comparable to other recognized trades, while creating mechanisms for quality control and professional development that protected both practitioners and patients. Dawn had barely broken over the medieval city of Cologne when 14-year-old Hans stumbled from his straw mattress in the cramped quarters above Master Wilhelm's barber shop. The year was 1387, and Hans was beginning his second year as an apprentice barber surgeon, a journey that would transform him from an illiterate peasant son into a skilled practitioner capable of saving lives or ending them with equal facility. His story illuminates the remarkable educational system that produced some of medieval Europe's most capable medical practitioners through a combination of brutal physical demands, intensive practical training, and gradual assumption of life and death responsibilities. The path that brought Hans to Master Wilhelm's shop was typical of his generation. Born in a small village outside Cologne, he had shown unusual dexterity as a child, able to whittle intricate figures from wood and tie complex knots that baffled his peers. When a traveling barber surgeon visited the village to treat victims of a late-season fever outbreak, he noticed Hans's steady hands and quick mind. After negotiating with the boy's father, a transaction that involved a modest payment and promises of future consideration, arrangements were made for Hans to begin his apprenticeship in the city. The physical environment that Hans entered was both fascinating and intimidating. Master Wilhelm's establishment occupied a prime location on one of Cologne's main commercial streets, its distinctive pole visible from considerable distance. The shop itself was larger than any building Hans had ever seen, with wide windows that filled the space with natural light during working hours. The walls were lined with instruments that gleamed in their carefully maintained cases, and the floors were swept clean each morning as part of the apprentice's duties. Master Wilhelm himself cut an imposing figure, a man in his 40s whose scarred hands testified to decades of demanding work, but whose gentle manner with patients revealed the compassion necessary for medical practice. He had trained 3 previous apprentices to successful completion of their terms, and his reputation for both technical skill and ethical conduct made his shop a desirable training ground for ambitious young men. The fact that Hans had been accepted as his apprentice represented an extraordinary opportunity for a peasant's son. The daily routine that Hans learned during his first months was exhausting in its intensity and scope. His day began at 4 a.m. with the essential task of sharpening and maintaining the shop's collection of instruments. This seemingly simple responsibility was actually one of the most critical aspects of professional practice. A dull blade could transform a routine procedure into a torturous ordeal, while improperly maintained instruments might introduce infections that could prove fatal. Hans learned to evaluate the condition of each tool, determine the appropriate maintenance required, and execute the delicate process of sharpening that restored perfect cutting edges. After instrument maintenance came shop preparation, sweeping floors, arranging materials, lighting fires for heating water, and cauterizing instruments, and ensuring that everything was ready for the day's activities. Only after completing these essential tasks could Hans begin the learning activities that would gradually transform him into a skilled practitioner. Master Wilhelm insisted that foundational skills be mastered thoroughly before more advanced techniques were attempted, a philosophy that emphasized patient safety over rapid progress. The educational methodology employed by Master Wilhelm reflected centuries of accumulated wisdom about effective skill transfer. Rather than overwhelming Hans with theoretical knowledge, training began with careful observation of Master Wilhelm's work with actual patients. Hans would stand silently beside his master, watching every movement, noting the sequence of procedures, and observing patient reactions to different approaches. This observational phase typically lasted several months, during which Hans absorbed countless details about professional practice without being allowed to touch patients directly. Gradually, Hans was permitted to assist with increasingly complex procedures. His first direct patient contact involved helping to position customers during haircuts and shaves, learning to anticipate his master's needs and respond quickly to requests for specific instruments or materials. These seemingly simple tasks actually required sophisticated understanding of procedural sequences and timing, as well as the development of patient interaction skills that would prove essential throughout his career. The progression from observation to assistance to independent practice followed a carefully structured sequence designed to build competence while minimizing risk. Hans's first independent procedures involved basic grooming services under close supervision, haircuts for regular customers whose needs were well understood, simple shaves for patients without unusual complications. Success in these routine tasks gradually earned him opportunities to attempt more challenging procedures like bloodletting and tooth extraction. Bloodletting presented particular educational challenges because it required both technical precision and theoretical understanding. Hans needed to master the physical techniques of making clean incisions with various types of instruments, while also learning the complex body of traditional knowledge that governed when, where, and how much bloodletting should be performed. Different ailments called for bloodletting from specific locations on the body, and the timing of treatments was influenced by factors including the patient's age, the phase of the moon, and seasonal considerations. The theoretical education that accompanied practical training was delivered through a combination of verbal instruction, memorized verses, and gradually expanding responsibilities. Master Wilhelm possessed an extensive repertoire of traditional knowledge acquired during his own apprenticeship and enhanced through decades of experience. This knowledge was transmitted through memorable verses and sayings that Hans was required to memorize, covering everything from anatomical landmarks to treatment protocols for common ailments. The social education that Hans received was equally important, though less formal. He learned to interact appropriately with customers from different social classes, understanding when deference was required and when professional authority should be asserted. The ability to inspire confidence while maintaining humility was essential for success, as patients needed to trust their barber surgeon's competence, while respecting the social boundaries that governed medieval society. Physical stamina and emotional resilience were tested constantly throughout the apprenticeship. The work was physically demanding, requiring Hans to stand for long hours while maintaining steady concentration and precise movements. The emotional challenges were equally daunting, as Hans gradually assumed responsibility for procedures that caused significant pain to conscious patients and carried genuine risks of serious complications or death. Master Wilhelm's approach to these challenges emphasized gradual exposure combined with careful support. Hans was initially assigned to assist with routine procedures that carried minimal risk, allowing him to become accustomed to patient suffering without bearing direct responsibility for outcomes. As his skills and confidence developed, he was gradually given more challenging cases and greater independence, always with Master Wilhelm available to provide guidance or intervene if complications arose. The business education that Hans received was practical and comprehensive, covering everything from pricing services to managing customer relationships, to maintaining financial records. He learned how to evaluate patients' ability to pay, adjust treatment recommendations based on financial circumstances, and negotiate payment terms that balanced business needs with ethical obligations. This commercial aspect of the profession was essential knowledge, as successful practitioners needed to maintain viable businesses while serving their community's medical needs. By his fourth year of apprenticeship, Hans had developed sufficient competence to work independently on routine cases, while continuing to learn more advanced techniques. He could perform bloodletting, extract teeth, treat minor wounds, and provide basic surgical services with confidence and skill. However, the most challenging procedures, complex surgeries, emergency treatments, and cases involving wealthy or important patients, remained under Master Wilhelm's direct supervision. The final years of apprenticeship focused on developing the judgment and professional maturity necessary for independent practice. Hans learned to evaluate patients carefully, determine when treatments were beyond his capabilities, and make referral decisions that protected both patient welfare and his professional reputation. He also began developing the network of professional relationships that would be essential for his eventual establishment as an independent practitioner. The completion of Hans's apprenticeship was marked by formal evaluation and recognition by the local barber surgeon guild. This process included demonstration of technical competencies, oral examination of theoretical knowledge, and assessment of professional character. Success in this evaluation process granted Hans the right to establish his own practice, though most new practitioners worked for established masters for additional years to gain experience and accumulate resources necessary for independent operation. In the dim candlelight of his workshop, Master Aldrich carefully examined the blade of his finest fleam, running his experienced finger along its edge to test the sharpness that could mean the difference between a clean, healing cut and a ragged wound prone to corruption. The year was 1453, and Aldrich had spent 3 decades perfecting his understanding of the instruments that defined his profession, an arsenal of specialized tools that required not only technical mastery, but also intimate knowledge of their capabilities and limitations. Each instrument in his collection told a story of innovation, tradition, and the relentless human pursuit of healing through technology. The evolution of surgical instruments during the medieval period represented a fascinating blend of inherited classical knowledge and practical innovation driven by field experience. When the first monk barbers began their transformation into secular practitioners, they carried with them tools that had remained largely unchanged since ancient Roman times. However, the demands of civilian practice and military surgery gradually drove innovations that improved both the effectiveness and safety of surgical procedures. The most fundamental and versatile instruments in any barber surgeon's collection were the various types of knives and razors used for cutting procedures. A master practitioner like Aldrich possessed dozens of these implements, each designed for specific purposes and maintained with obsessive care. His collection included delicate razors for precise facial shaving, heavier blades for surgical incisions, specialized knives for specific anatomical locations, and emergency instruments that could be quickly deployed in crisis situations. The quality of medieval steel varied dramatically over time and location, creating significant challenges for instrument makers and users alike. Early medieval instruments were often made from iron that was difficult to harden properly and prone to developing pits and notches that made effective sharpening nearly impossible. The gradual improvement in metallurgical techniques during the later medieval period produced progressively better steel that could hold sharper edges and withstand the stresses of repeated use. Aldrich's prized possession was a set of surgical knives forged by a master craftsman in Milan, where Italian armorers had developed some of the finest steelworking techniques in Europe. These instruments represented a significant investment. The cost of a single high-quality surgical knife could exceed a craftsman's monthly wages. But their superior performance and durability made them essential tools for serious practitioners. The blades were made from carefully selected steel that had been folded and hammered repeatedly to eliminate impurities, then heated and cooled, according to closely guarded techniques that produced metal of exceptional hardness and resilience. The maintenance of sharp instruments was both science and art, requiring knowledge of metallurgy, physics, and the subtle characteristics of individual tools. Aldrich began each day with a ritual inspection of his instruments, evaluating their condition and determining what maintenance was required. Razors used for shaving needed daily attention to maintain their fine edges, while surgical instruments might require weekly or monthly sharpening, depending on their frequency of use and the procedures for which they had been employed. The sharpening process itself was a meditation in precision and patience. Aldrich used a variety of whetstones, each with different abrasive qualities suited to specific stages of the sharpening process. Coarse stones removed nicks and restored basic geometry to damaged blades, while progressively finer stones refined the edge to surgical sharpness. The final stage involved stropping on leather surfaces that polished the metal to mirror brightness while aligning the microscopic teeth of the cutting edge. Bloodletting instruments represented the most specialized and frequently used tools in the medieval medical arsenal. Aldrich's collection included thumb lancets, fleams, scarificators, and cupping vessels, each designed for specific types of bloodletting procedures and patient populations. The thumb lancet was perhaps the most elegant of these instruments, featuring a sharp blade that folded into a decorative case made from precious materials like ivory, mother of pearl, or silver. These cases often bore inscriptions, family crests, or dedications that reflected the importance of the instruments to their owners. Fleams were more robust instruments designed for larger incisions and more aggressive bloodletting. The characteristic right-angled blade was struck with a wooden mallet, called a fleam stick, allowing controlled penetration of blood vessels without the hand tremors that might affect direct pressure techniques. Aldrich owned fleams with blades of various sizes, from delicate instruments suitable for children and elderly patients to massive implements designed for robust adults requiring aggressive treatment. The scarificator represented the pinnacle of bloodletting technology, incorporating complex spring-loaded mechanisms that could make multiple simultaneous incisions. These sophisticated instruments contained anywhere from 4 to 20 small blades, each individually spring-loaded and released simultaneously by triggering a central mechanism. The precise manufacturing required to create these instruments made them expensive and prestigious tools that marked their owners as practitioners of advanced medical techniques. Cupping vessels completed the bloodletting equipment set, providing the suction necessary for effective blood extraction. These glass or horn cups were heated over flames and then quickly applied to scarified skin, creating vacuum pressure that drew blood from capillaries. The dramatic visual effect of cupping, with blood visibly rising into the transparent vessels, made it a popular treatment that patients could see was working, even when therapeutic benefits were questionable. Surgical instruments for more complex procedures required even greater precision and specialized design. Aldrich's collection included bone saws for amputation, hooks and retractors for wound management, probes for examining injuries, forceps for removing foreign objects, and cauterizing irons for controlling bleeding. Each of these instruments had evolved through centuries of use, with subtle modifications that improved their effectiveness for specific procedures, Trepanation instruments represented some of the most sophisticated surgical technology available to medieval practitioners. The trephine, a circular saw designed to cut through skull bone, required exceptional precision in its manufacture and extraordinary skill in its use. Aldrich owned several trephines of different sizes, along with the specialized rasps, elevators, and protective guards that made safe cranial surgery possible. The courage required to use these instruments on conscious patients, combined with the technical skill necessary for successful outcomes, made trepanation one of the most challenging procedures in medieval surgery. Dental instruments formed another specialized category in the medieval surgical toolkit. Tooth extraction required forceps, designed for different types of teeth and various extraction situations. Aldrich's dental forceps included delicate instruments for front teeth, heavy-duty tools for molars, and specialized designs for broken or severely decayed teeth that required particular extraction techniques. The absence of effective anesthesia made dental extraction one of the most dreaded procedures in medieval medicine, placing enormous emphasis on speed and precision in instrument use. The organization and portability of surgical instruments presented practical challenges that influenced both instrument design and professional practice. Traveling practitioners, like military surgeons, needed compact, durable tool sets that could withstand the rigors of campaign life, while providing capabilities for treating a wide range of injuries. Aldrich's military kit was organized in a specially constructed leather case that protected delicate instruments while allowing quick access during emergency situations. The symbolic and social significance of surgical instruments extended beyond their purely functional roles. The quality and organization of a practitioner's tools served as visible evidence of professional competence and financial success. Wealthy practitioners invested heavily in elaborate instrument cases and decorative elements that enhanced their professional prestige, while struggling practitioners made do with basic tools that might compromise their effectiveness, but were all they could afford. The relationship between practitioner and instruments was intensely personal, reflecting years of shared experience in treating patients and facing professional challenges. Aldrich could identify each of his instruments by touch in complete darkness, understanding their individual characteristics and quirks as intimately as he knew his own hands. This intimate familiarity was essential for effective practice, as surgical procedures often occurred in poor lighting conditions where visual identification of instruments was impossible. The care and maintenance of surgical instruments was never merely technical but carried deep, professional, and ethical implications. A practitioner who failed to maintain his tools properly was not only compromising his own effectiveness, but violating his obligations to patients who trusted their lives to his skill. The daily ritual of instrument care served as a constant reminder of these responsibilities, while providing opportunities for reflection on the day's work and preparation for future challenges. The screams began at dawn and continued until well after sunset, echoing through the narrow streets of medieval Bruges, as Master Cornelius performed a series of procedures that would test both his surgical skills and his emotional endurance. The year was 1472, and the approaching winter had brought an unusual number of patients to his shop. Merchants with infected wounds from difficult journeys, craftsmen with injured hands from industrial accidents, and soldiers bearing the scars of recent conflicts along the Flemish borders. This particular day would illustrate both the extraordinary challenges and the profound satisfactions of medieval surgical practice, revealing the human drama that unfolded daily in barber surgeon establishments across Europe. The first patient arrived before Master Cornelius had finished his morning ritual of instrument preparation. Jan, a wool merchant whose successful business had made him one of Bruges' most prosperous citizens, entered the shop with his left hand wrapped in blood-stained bandages and his face pale with pain and fever. 3 days earlier, while examining a shipment of English wool, Jan had caught his hand on a broken crate nail that drove deep into his palm. What had seemed like a minor injury had rapidly developed into a serious infection that now threatened not only his hand, but possibly his life. The examination that Master Cornelius conducted revealed the grim realities of medieval wound care. The original puncture wound had closed over surface dirt and debris, creating an ideal environment for the proliferation of bacteria that medieval practitioners could not see but certainly understood through bitter experience. Red streaks radiating up John's forearm indicated that the infection was spreading through his lymphatic system, a development that often preceded the general blood poisoning that killed even wealthy patients with access to the best medical care available. Master Cornelius faced a decision that epitomized the challenges of medieval surgery, whether to attempt saving the hand through aggressive cleaning and treatment, or to recommend immediate amputation before the infection spread further. The choice involved not only medical considerations, but also complex social and economic factors. Jan's livelihood depended on his ability to handle merchandise and conduct business personally. The loss of a hand would devastate his commercial activities and social standing. However, delay in treatment could easily result in death, making preservation of the hand a moot consideration. The surgical procedure that Master Cornelius decided to attempt represented state-of-the-art medieval wound treatment. First, he administered the strongest pain relief available, a mixture of wine, opium, and henbane that would dull Jan's senses without rendering him completely unconscious. The patient was positioned on a specially constructed surgical table that allowed good access to the injured hand, while providing restraints to limit movement during the painful procedure. Using his sharpest surgical knife, Master Cornelius carefully reopened the puncture wound, extending the incision to allow thorough access to the infected tissues beneath. The putrid smell that emerged confirmed his worst fears. The infection had penetrated deep into the hand, affecting muscles, tendons, and possibly bones. Working quickly but carefully, he used small forceps to remove debris and necrotic tissue, while irrigating the wound with wine and vinegar solutions believed to combat corruption. The cleaning process was agonizing for Jan, despite the pain medication, and his struggles required 2 assistants to maintain proper positioning while Master Cornelius worked. Each piece of infected tissue that was removed brought fresh bleeding that needed to be controlled, either through pressure or cauterization with heated instruments. The smell of burning flesh mixed with the odors of infection and medicinal preparations, creating an atmosphere that would challenge the strongest stomach. After nearly 2 hours of intensive work, Master Cornelius had removed what he believed to be all infected material and thoroughly cleaned the wound cavity. The hand was packed with clean linen, soaked in healing preparations made from honey, wine, and aromatic herbs, then carefully bandaged with layers of clean cloth. Jan was given detailed instructions for wound care and warned to return immediately if fever developed or if the infection showed signs of spreading. The successful treatment of Jan's infected wound represented just the beginning of Master Cornelius's challenging day. His second patient presented an entirely different set of problems that would test his surgical skills in ways that no amount of training could fully prepare him to handle. Maria, the 14-year-old daughter of a successful baker, had been suffering from severe toothaches for weeks before her father finally brought her for treatment. The dental problems that Master Cornelius discovered during his examination of Maria were typical of medieval oral health but nonetheless shocking in their severity. Multiple teeth showed signs of advanced decay, with several having developed abscesses that had created painful swellings in her jaw and neck. The absence of effective dental hygiene, combined with a diet high in grain-based foods and honey, had created ideal conditions for tooth decay that often began in childhood and progressed relentlessly throughout life. Tooth extraction in the medieval period was always a traumatic procedure, but Maria's case presented unusual complications that made the surgery particularly challenging. The infected teeth had become brittle and were likely to break during extraction attempts, while the surrounding gum inflammation made proper grip difficult to achieve. Master Cornelius selected his heaviest dental forceps and positioned Maria in a chair that allowed him to use his body weight to provide the leverage necessary for difficult extractions. The first tooth came out cleanly after several minutes of careful pressure and manipulation, bringing immediate relief to Maria, despite the pain of the extraction process. However, the second tooth broke during the extraction attempt, leaving root fragments embedded in the jawbone that would need to be removed individually. This complication transformed a routine procedure into a complex surgical challenge requiring delicate work with small instruments in a mouth filled with blood and saliva. Working by candlelight in Maria's open mouth, Master Cornelius used narrow forceps and small hooks to locate and remove the embedded root fragments. Each piece had to be extracted carefully to avoid damaging the jawbone or leaving infected material that could cause future problems. The procedure took over an hour to complete, during which Maria's father held her hands and whispered prayers, while Master Cornelius worked with the intense concentration that marked truly skilled practitioners. The afternoon brought Master Cornelius's most challenging case of the day. A young soldier named Willem, who had been injured during a skirmish with bandits on the roads leading to Bruges. An arrow had penetrated his thigh, driving deep into the muscle before the iron head became lodged against his femur. The wound had occurred 3 days earlier, and Willem's condition was deteriorating rapidly as infection set in around the foreign object that his comrades had been afraid to remove. Arrow extraction represented one of the most technically demanding procedures in medieval surgery, requiring intimate knowledge of anatomy combined with surgical skills that could mean the difference between saving a limb and causing permanent disability or death. The barbed design of medieval arrowheads made simple withdrawal impossible without causing massive tissue damage, while pushing the arrow completely through the body risked severing major blood vessels or damaging vital organs. Master Cornelius examined Willem's wound carefully, determining the exact position of the arrowhead through gentle palpation and observation of the entry angle. The arrow had fortunately missed the major blood vessels in the thigh, but its position against the femur created complications that would require careful surgical technique to resolve safely. He selected a specialized instrument called an arrow spoon, a device designed specifically for extracting embedded projectiles, along with narrow forceps and retractors that would allow him to work in the deep wound cavity. The extraction procedure required Master Cornelius to enlarge Willem's wound significantly to gain access to the embedded arrowhead. Using his sharpest surgical knife, he carefully extended the original wound opening while controlling bleeding through pressure and cauterization. The deeper he penetrated into Willem's thigh, the more challenging the procedure became, as blood and tissue fluids obscured his view, while the patient's movements from pain made precise work increasingly difficult. After nearly 3 hours of painstaking surgery, Master Cornelius finally managed to grasp the arrowhead with his forceps and begin the delicate process of extraction. The barbed design that made arrows so effective as weapons also made them extremely difficult to remove without causing additional tissue damage. Working millimeter by millimeter, He gradually worked the arrowhead free from its position against the bone, while monitoring Willem's condition for signs of shock or excessive blood loss. The successful removal of the arrowhead brought immediate relief to Willem, though his recovery would depend on preventing infection in the extensive wound that the extraction had necessarily created. Master Cornelius packed the wound cavity with clean linen soaked in wine and aromatic preparations, then bandaged the entire thigh with multiple layers of cloth that would need to be changed regularly as healing progressed. The emotional toll of such intensive surgical work was considerable, even for experienced practitioners like Master Cornelius. Each procedure carried genuine risks of complications or death, creating constant pressure to perform perfectly, under conditions that would challenge modern surgeons equipped with far superior tools and knowledge. The screams of patients undergoing procedures without effective anesthesia, the sight of massive bleeding from surgical incisions, and the ever-present possibility of treatment failure created psychological stresses that marked every practitioner who survived long enough to develop expertise. Yet the satisfactions of successful treatment provided powerful compensation for these challenges. When Jan returned a week later, with his hand healing cleanly and his infection controlled, Master Cornelius experienced the profound fulfillment that came from literally saving a man's livelihood and possibly his life. Maria's relief from the dental pain that had tormented her for months, and Willem's gradual recovery from what could easily have been a fatal injury, provided the motivation necessary to continue practicing a profession that demanded everything its practitioners had to give. The social dynamics of medieval surgical practice added additional layers of complexity to the technical challenges. Master Cornelius needed to inspire confidence in patients who were entrusting their lives to his skills, while maintaining appropriate relationships with family members who were often more frightened than the patients themselves. The ability to remain calm and reassuring during crisis situations, while making difficult decisions quickly and implementing them effectively, marked the difference between successful practitioners and those who failed under pressure. The morning of October 25th, 1415, dawned cold and wet across the muddy fields of northern France, where two armies faced each other in what would become one of the most famous battles in medieval history. Among the English forces preparing for the Battle of Agincourt stood Master Thomas of Warwick, a barber surgeon whose skills would prove as crucial to victory as any knight's sword or archer's bow. Carrying a leather satchel filled with surgical instruments and accompanied by two apprentices bearing supplies of bandages, wine, and medicinal preparations, Master Thomas represented a new breed of military professional whose expertise could mean the difference between death and survival for countless soldiers. The role of barber surgeons in medieval warfare had evolved dramatically during the centuries of constant conflict that characterized European politics. Early military campaigns had relied primarily on the healing traditions of military chaplains and the practical knowledge of veteran soldiers who had learned basic wound care through bitter experience. However, the increasing sophistication of weapons technology and the growing scale of military conflicts had created a demand for more skilled medical practitioners who could treat the devastating injuries produced by medieval combat. Master Thomas had earned his appointment to Henry V's expedition through a combination of proven surgical skill and political connections that reflected the complex social dynamics of medieval military organization. His father had served the Earl of Warwick as a household barber surgeon, establishing family relationships that opened doors for advancement when military opportunities arose. However, family connections alone would not have secured such a prestigious appointment. Master Thomas had demonstrated exceptional competence in treating injuries, and had developed innovative techniques for battlefield surgery that set him apart from ordinary practitioners. The challenges facing military barber surgeons were fundamentally different from those encountered in civilian practice, beginning with the sheer scale and severity of injuries produced by medieval weapons. A typical day of civilian practice might involve treating a handful of patients with relatively minor complaints, but battlefield medicine meant confronting dozens or hundreds of casualties with injuries that tested every skill a practitioner possessed. Arrow wounds, sword cuts, crushing injuries from maces and warhammers, and the devastating trauma produced by early firearms created a catalog of medical emergencies that required instant decision-making and surgical techniques adapted to mass casualty situations. The weapons that dominated medieval battlefields were specifically designed to inflict maximum damage on human bodies, creating injuries that challenged even the most skilled barber surgeons. The English longbow, for example, could drive arrows completely through a man's body at ranges exceeding 200 yards, while crossbow bolts possessed even greater penetrating power that could punch through armor and embed deeply in bones. Swords and axes produced deep cuts that severed muscles, tendons, and blood vessels, while maces and warhammers created crushing injuries that shattered bones and caused internal bleeding that was often impossible to control with medieval surgical techniques. The treatment of arrow wounds represented one of the most technically demanding aspects of battlefield surgery, requiring specialized knowledge and instruments that Master Thomas had spent years perfecting. Medieval arrows were designed with barbed heads that made simple withdrawal impossible without causing massive additional tissue damage. The conventional approach involved pushing arrows completely through the body when anatomically feasible. But this technique was often impossible when arrows had struck bones or vital organs. Master Thomas had developed an innovative approach to arrow extraction based on his understanding of medieval arrowhead design and construction. Rather than attempting to withdraw barbed arrows directly, he used specialized instruments to collapse or remove the barbs before extraction, significantly reducing tissue damage and improving survival rates. This technique required intimate knowledge of different arrowhead designs and the metallurgical skills necessary to modify embedded projectiles safely. The psychological challenges of battlefield surgery were as demanding as the technical aspects, requiring Master Thomas to function effectively under conditions that would overwhelm practitioners accustomed only to civilian medicine. The chaos of combat, with its constant noise, confusion, and immediate physical danger, created an environment where concentration and precision were essential, but extremely difficult to maintain. The screams of wounded men, the sight of devastating injuries, and the knowledge that treatment delays could mean death for patients created enormous psychological pressure that marked every military medical practitioner. Working conditions on medieval battlefields were primitive, even by the standards of the time, with barber surgeons often forced to perform complex procedures under open skies using whatever shelter and lighting could be improvised from available materials. The absence of clean water, proper surgical facilities, and adequate supplies meant that military practitioners had to adapt civilian techniques to battlefield realities, while maintaining treatment standards that could preserve life and prevent infection. Master Thomas had learned to prioritize cases based on a brutal calculus of survival probabilities and resource allocation that had no equivalent in civilian practice. Soldiers with minor wounds that could be quickly treated and returned to combat received immediate attention, while those with injuries requiring extensive surgery might be set aside if their survival prospects were poor. This triage system, though harsh by modern standards, represented a rational approach to resource management that maximized the number of lives saved under impossible conditions. The treatment of specific types of battlefield injuries had driven innovations in surgical technique that would eventually benefit civilian practice as well. The prevalence of infected wounds in military settings had taught Master Thomas the importance of aggressive wound cleaning and drainage procedures that prevented the development of gangrene. His experience with traumatic amputations had led to improvements in stump preparation and wound closure techniques that reduced infection rates and improved functional outcomes for survivors. The management of blood loss represented another area where military necessity had driven surgical innovation. The massive bleeding associated with combat injuries required rapid intervention techniques that could control hemorrhage before patients died from shock. Master Thomas had developed improved methods for identifying and ligating severed blood vessels, along with pressure techniques and cauterization procedures that could quickly control bleeding in battlefield conditions. Pain management in military surgery presented unique challenges due to the limited availability of effective medications and the need for treatments that would not compromise patients' ability to function if they recovered sufficiently to return to combat. The traditional combinations of wine, opium, and herbal preparations used in civilian practice were often unavailable in military settings, forcing practitioners to develop alternative approaches that relied more heavily on surgical technique and patient management. The social dynamics of military medical practice added additional complications to the technical challenges facing practitioners like Master Thomas. Military hierarchies meant that treatment priority was often determined by social rank rather than medical need, requiring barber surgeons to navigate complex political relationships while maintaining professional ethics. The treatment of enemy wounded raised questions about professional obligations that had no clear answers, while relationships with military commanders required diplomatic skills that were never part of traditional medical training. The experience gained through military service often transformed practitioners in ways that enhanced their civilian careers upon return to peacetime practice. Master Thomas's innovations in surgical technique, his experience with mass casualty management, and his reputation for maintaining effectiveness under extreme conditions made him a highly sought-after practitioner when he eventually returned to civilian practice. The psychological resilience developed through battlefield experience also proved valuable in civilian emergencies that might overwhelm practitioners without military backgrounds. The long-term impact of military barber surgeons extended beyond their individual contributions to encompass fundamental changes in medical practice and surgical education. The techniques developed for treating battlefield injuries gradually found their way into civilian medicine, improving treatment outcomes for accident victims and surgical patients throughout Europe. The emphasis on practical skill development and empirical observation that characterized military medicine also influenced the evolution of surgical training programs that emphasized hands-on experience over theoretical knowledge. In the smoke-filled tent that served as a field hospital outside the besieged city of Turin, a young French barber surgeon named Ambroise Paré made a discovery that would revolutionize surgical practice and save countless lives throughout the centuries to come. The year was 1537, and Paré had just run out of the boiling oil traditionally used to treat gunshot wounds, a development that might have seemed like a disaster, but would instead become one of the most important moments in the history of medicine. His improvised treatment, using a gentle mixture of egg yolk, rose oil, and turpentine, would demonstrate that compassion and careful observation could triumph over established medical doctrine, establishing principles that continue to guide surgical practice today. The journey that brought Ambroise Paré to this pivotal moment began in the small French town of Bourg-Hersant, where he was born around 1510 into a family of modest means. His father was a craftsman whose trade provided a comfortable but unremarkable living, while his mother managed the household with the practical efficiency that characterized successful artisan families. Young Ambrose showed early signs of the intellectual curiosity and manual dexterity that would later serve him so well, but his family's financial circumstances precluded the university education that might have led to a career as a physician. Instead, Paré found himself apprenticed to a barber surgeon in Paris, beginning the arduous 7-year training program that would transform him from an illiterate village boy into one of history's most influential medical practitioners. The apprenticeship system that shaped Paré's early development was both brutal and effective, combining intensive practical training with gradual assumption of real responsibility for patient care. His master, a skilled practitioner who served both civilian patients and military personnel, provided Paré with exposure to the full range of surgical procedures while emphasizing the importance of careful observation and continuous learning. The intellectual limitations imposed by Paré's background, particularly his inability to master Latin, the language of scholarly medicine, proved to be unexpected advantages that shaped his revolutionary approach to surgical practice. Unable to rely on classical authorities like Galen and Hippocrates, Paré was forced to develop his medical knowledge through direct observation and empirical testing. This practical approach made him skeptical of treatments that produced poor results, regardless of their theoretical justification or historical precedent. Paré's first military assignment came in 1536, when he joined the expedition of Marshal de Montejon as a young barber surgeon, eager to prove his skills in the most demanding environment possible. Military service represented both opportunity and danger for ambitious practitioners. Successful military surgeons could earn reputations that opened doors to prestigious civilian appointments. But the challenges of battlefield medicine also claimed many promising careers. Paré's combination of technical skill, innovative thinking, and psychological resilience would prove ideally suited to military medical practice. The siege of Turin, where Paré made his famous discovery, was typical of the brutal warfare that characterized 16th-century European politics. Artillery bombardments and small arms fire produced horrific injuries that challenged traditional surgical approaches, while the confined conditions of siege warfare created ideal environments for the spread of infection and disease. The conventional treatment for gunshot wounds involved pouring boiling oil directly into the wound, based on the theory that gunpowder poisoned the tissues, and that extreme heat was necessary to neutralize this contamination. The shortage of oil that forced Paré to improvise alternative treatment represented the kind of crisis that often drives medical innovation. Faced with wounded soldiers who required immediate treatment, Paré mixed together the ingredients he had available: egg yolk for its supposed healing properties, rose oil for its pleasant smell and cooling effect, and turpentine for its presumed antiseptic qualities. The mixture was applied to wounds as a gentle salve, rather than poured as a scalding liquid, representing a fundamental change in approach that reflected Paré's instinctive compassion for patient suffering. The results of Paré's experiment were immediately apparent and ultimately revolutionary. Soldiers treated with the gentle salve slept comfortably through the night and showed rapid healing with minimal infection, while those who had received the traditional boiling oil treatment suffered severe pain, fever, and delayed healing. This dramatic difference in outcomes led Paré to question not only the specific treatment protocol, but the entire theoretical framework that justified causing additional pain to patients who were already suffering. The philosophical transformation that this experience triggered in Paré's thinking extended far beyond wound treatment to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of healing and the responsibilities of medical practitioners. Traditional medical theory held that disease and injury resulted from supernatural causes or imbalances in bodily humors that required dramatic interventions to correct. Pare's empirical observations suggested instead that the body possessed natural healing capabilities that could be supported through gentle treatment and careful wound management. This new understanding of healing led Pare to develop innovative surgical techniques that minimize trauma while maximizing therapeutic effectiveness. His introduction of ligatures to control bleeding during amputation replaced the traditional practice of cauterization, which involved searing arteries with red-hot irons to seal them shut. The ligature technique was not entirely new. Ancient physicians had occasionally used silk threads to tie off blood vessels, but Pare developed systematic methods for identifying and securing arteries that made the procedure reliable and reproducible. The impact of Pare's innovations in amputation technique cannot be overstated. Traditional cauterization caused excruciating pain, often induced shock that killed patients who might otherwise have survived, and frequently failed to control bleeding effectively. Pare's ligature method was not only more humane but also more successful, dramatically improving survival rates for patients requiring amputation while reducing the psychological trauma associated with the procedure. Pare's commitment to surgical innovation extended beyond technique to encompass the development of prosthetic devices that could restore function and dignity to patients who had lost limbs. His artificial hands, crafted from precious metals and operated by springs and catches, represented marvels of Renaissance engineering that allowed amputees to perform complex tasks. His prosthetic legs incorporated joints and articulated mechanisms that enabled more natural walking, while his artificial eyes, made from gold and silver, helped restore confidence to patients who had suffered facial injuries. The decision to publish his surgical knowledge in French rather than Latin represented another revolutionary aspect of Pare's career, democratizing medical knowledge in ways that challenged the traditional monopoly of university-trained physicians. His books, filled with detailed illustrations of surgical instruments and procedures, made advanced surgical techniques accessible to barber surgeons throughout Europe who lacked classical education. This publication strategy reflected Pare's belief that medical knowledge belonged to all practitioners who could use it to help patients, rather than being the exclusive property of a learned elite. Pare's rise from humble barber surgeon to royal physician illustrates the social mobility that exceptional skill could achieve within the medieval medical hierarchy. His appointment as surgeon to Henry II of France in 1552 represented the pinnacle of professional success, providing access to the latest medical knowledge while establishing his reputation throughout European medical circles. His subsequent service to 3 additional French kings demonstrated that royal favor, once earned through demonstrable competence, could sustain long and influential careers. The innovations that Pare introduced in obstetric care reflected his comprehensive approach to surgical practice and his willingness to challenge established procedures that caused unnecessary suffering. His development of new techniques for managing difficult births, including methods for turning breached babies and procedures for removing retained placentas, saved countless lives and established obstetrics as a legitimate surgical specialty. His emphasis on gentle manipulation rather than forceful intervention reflected the same philosophical approach that had guided his wound care innovations. The legacy of Ambroise Pare extends beyond his specific technical contributions to encompass fundamental changes in medical philosophy and practice that continue to influence healthcare today. His emphasis on empirical observation over theoretical authority established the scientific method as the foundation of medical progress. His commitment to patient comfort and dignity demonstrated that compassion and effectiveness were complementary rather than competing values in medical practice. His willingness to share knowledge freely established precedents for medical education and professional development that shaped the evolution of surgical training. In the flickering candlelight of a cramped chamber above a bakery in medieval London, Dame Marjorie carefully examined the swollen belly of a young merchant's wife, whose difficult pregnancy had already claimed the lives of two previous children. The year was 1348, and Dame Marjorie represented a shadowy but crucial segment of medieval medical practice. The women who provided surgical and medical services despite growing restrictions on their participation in formal medical professions. Her story illuminates a largely forgotten chapter in the history of medieval surgery, revealing how gender, social class, and evolving professional structures combined to shape opportunities for women in medical practice. The participation of women in medieval surgery was complex and constantly evolving, reflecting broader social changes that affected women's roles throughout European society. In the early medieval period, women had enjoyed relatively broad participation in medical practice, often serving as the primary healthcare providers for their communities. Monasteries and convents had provided educational opportunities that allowed women to develop medical knowledge, while the absence of formal licensing systems had permitted capable women to establish successful practices based purely on demonstrated competence. Dame Marjorie's own path to medical practice illustrated the informal networks and family connections that often enabled women to acquire surgical skills despite formal barriers to their participation. Born into a prosperous merchant family, she had received an unusually good education for a woman of her time, learning to read and write in both English and French, while developing the mathematical skills necessary for managing complex commercial transactions. Her introduction to medical practice came through marriage to Master Geoffrey, an established barber surgeon whose practice served both wealthy merchants and common laborers in one of London's most commercial districts. The early years of Dame Marjorie's marriage had provided extensive opportunities to observe and gradually participate in medical practice. Medieval medical practice was often a family enterprise, with wives and daughters serving as assistants, apprentices, and eventually practitioners in their own right. Dame Marjorie's natural aptitude for the work, combined with her literacy and social connections, had made her an invaluable partner in her husband's practice, well before circumstances forced her to assume primary responsibility for patient care. The transformation from assistant to independent practitioner came when Master Geoffrey died suddenly of fever during the plague outbreak of 1347, leaving Dame Marjorie with a choice between abandoning the practice that had become central to her identity or attempting to continue serving patients despite the legal and social obstacles she would face. Her decision to continue practicing represented both personal courage and recognition that her community's medical needs were too pressing to abandon for the sake of social conventions. The legal framework governing women's participation in medical practice varied significantly across different regions and time periods, reflecting the complex interplay between local customs, guild regulations, and broader social attitudes toward women's work. In some areas, widows were permitted to continue their deceased husband's practices under specific conditions and limitations, while other jurisdictions prohibited women from practicing surgery entirely. Dame Marjorie operated in a legal gray area, where custom and necessity often overruled formal regulations, but her position remained precarious and dependent on community acceptance. The types of medical practice available to women were often limited by social expectations and formal restrictions that channeled them toward particular specialties. Obstetrics and gynecology represented areas where women's participation was not only tolerated, but actively preferred, as cultural taboos made it inappropriate for male practitioners to examine or treat women's reproductive health. Dame Marjorie's expertise in managing difficult births and treating female complaints provided a stable foundation for her practice, while allowing her to develop surgical skills in less controversial contexts. The social dynamics of medieval medical practice created unique challenges for women practitioners who needed to establish authority and inspire confidence while navigating complex relationships with male colleagues, guild officials, and patients from different social classes. Dame Marjorie's success depended partly on her ability to project competence and reliability, while maintaining the appearance of appropriate feminine deference to male authority figures who controlled access to resources and referral networks. The technical challenges facing women surgeons were identical to those confronting their male colleagues, but the social context in which they practiced created additional pressures that could affect treatment outcomes. The need to prove competence repeatedly, combined with limited access to formal training opportunities and professional networks, meant that women practitioners often had to achieve higher standards of performance to maintain their practices. Dame Marjorie's reputation for successful outcomes in difficult cases was essential not only for attracting patients, but also for maintaining the community acceptance that allowed her to continue practicing. The economic aspects of women's medical practice reflected broader patterns of gender discrimination that affected women's work throughout medieval society. Women practitioners typically earned less than their male counterparts for equivalent services, while facing higher barriers to accessing credit, securing premises, and obtaining the expensive instruments necessary for effective practice. Dame Marjorie's inherited practice provided advantages that would have been difficult to achieve through independent establishment, but maintaining profitability required careful management of resources and patient relationships. The educational opportunities available to women interested in medical practice were severely limited by formal restrictions on their participation in apprenticeship programs and guild activities. Most women who developed surgical skills did so through informal family training or personal mentorship relationships that provided practical experience without official recognition. Dame Marjorie's knowledge had been acquired through years of observation and gradual participation in her husband's practice, supplemented by informal consultation with other practitioners who were willing to share their expertise. The innovations that women brought to surgical practice often reflected their unique perspectives and social positions within medieval society. Dame Marjorie had developed improved techniques for managing pain during childbirth, using combinations of herbal preparations and positioning methods that reduced trauma while improving outcomes for both mothers and children. Her approaches to post-surgical care emphasized patient comfort and family involvement in ways that male practitioners sometimes overlooked. The relationships between women practitioners and formal medical institutions were often strained by competing interests and conflicting social expectations. University-trained physicians generally viewed women practitioners as unqualified competitors who threatened their professional monopoly, while guild officials worried that female participation would undermine the masculine character of surgical practice. Dame Marjorie maintained cordial but cautious relationships with established male practitioners, seeking consultation when appropriate, while avoiding conflicts that might jeopardize her ability to continue practicing. The decline of women's participation in surgical practice during the later medieval period reflected broader social changes that restricted women's professional opportunities while consolidating medical practice under increasingly formal institutional control. The establishment of licensing systems, the growth of university medical education, and the strengthening of guild restrictions combined to exclude women from surgical practice in ways that had been impossible during the more fluid early medieval period. The legacy of women practitioners like Dame Marjorie is preserved primarily in fragmentary records and indirect references that provide glimpses of their contributions without fully documenting their achievements. Their innovations in patient care, their development of specialized techniques, and their dedication to serving community medical needs established precedents that would eventually support the reintegration of women into medical practice centuries later. Their stories remind us that the history of medieval surgery includes many voices that have been marginalized or forgotten, but whose contributions were essential to the development of medical knowledge and practice. The Great Hall of the London Guild of Barber Surgeons buzzed with nervous excitement as Thomas Whitmore stepped forward to take the oath that would transform him from journeyman to master practitioner. The year was 1485, and the elaborate ceremony taking place represented far more than a simple professional advancement. It was Thomas's initiation into one of medieval Europe's most influential brotherhood organizations, a guild system that provided structure, protection, and identity for practitioners of the dual arts of surgery and barbering. The words of the ancient oath echoed through the hall, binding Thomas not only to professional standards, but to a network of mutual obligations that would shape the rest of his career and define his place within the complex social hierarchy of medieval society. The guild system that governed medieval barber surgeons had evolved over centuries from informal associations of practitioners into sophisticated organizations that controlled every aspect of professional life. The earliest guilds emerged during the 12th and 13th centuries as craftsmen and merchants sought protection from economic competition and social discrimination through collective organization. For barber surgeons, guild membership provided not only economic benefits, but also social legitimacy for a profession that occupied an ambiguous position between respectable craft and questionable trade. The guild hall, where Thomas took his oath, represented the accumulated wealth and influence of generations of successful practitioners who had transformed a humble craft into a recognized profession. The building itself, with its carved stone facade and stained glass windows depicting the tools and symbols of the trade, proclaimed the guild's status and permanence to anyone who passed through London's commercial districts. Inside, the Great Hall was furnished with expensive tapestries, silver ceremonial objects, and portraits of distinguished members whose achievements had brought honor to the profession. The ceremony that elevated Thomas to master status was steeped in traditions that connected contemporary practitioners with centuries of professional heritage. The oath he recited had been refined over generations to encompass both practical obligations and ethical principles that governed relationships between guild members, patients, and the broader community. Each phrase carried weight, accumulated through years of experience with professional challenges and moral dilemmas that had shaped the guild's understanding of proper conduct. The professional standards established by guild membership were comprehensive and demanding, covering everything from technical competence to ethical behavior to financial responsibility. Masters were required to demonstrate mastery of all procedures within their scope of practice, from basic grooming services to complex surgical interventions. They were expected to maintain their instruments in perfect condition, keep their shops clean and well organized, and treat patients with respect regardless of their social status or ability to pay. The economic regulations imposed by guild membership created a complex system of mutual protection and controlled competition that shaped business practices throughout the profession. No master was permitted to own more than one shop, ensuring that opportunities were distributed among members rather than concentrated in the hands of a few successful entrepreneurs. Pricing was regulated to prevent unfair competition while ensuring that services remained accessible to patients from different economic backgrounds. The apprenticeship system that Thomas had completed was carefully regulated by guild statutes that protected both masters and students, while ensuring the transmission of professional knowledge to future generations. Masters could take only a limited number of apprentices at any given time, and they were required to provide comprehensive training that covered all aspects of professional practice. Apprentices were guaranteed fair treatment, adequate training, and eventual recognition upon completion of their terms. The social welfare functions of medieval guilds provided crucial support for members and their families during times of crisis or hardship. The guild maintained funds for assisting members who became ill or disabled, supporting widows and orphans of deceased practitioners, and providing for members who faced financial difficulties through no fault of their own. These mutual aid programs created bonds of solidarity that extended far beyond simple business relationships. The relationship between guild membership and civic responsibility reflected the integral role that professional organizations played in medieval urban life. Guild members were expected to participate in civic ceremonies, contribute to municipal projects, and serve in local government positions when called upon. The Barber Surgeons Guild, like other professional organizations, maintained charitable activities that demonstrated its commitment to community welfare while enhancing its public reputation. The internal governance of the guild was democratic in principle, but hierarchical in practice, reflecting the broader social structures of medieval society. Senior masters, who had achieved distinction through successful practice and community service, formed a council that made policy decisions and resolved disputes between members. This governing body was responsible for maintaining professional standards, enforcing guild regulations, and representing member interests in negotiations with civic authorities. The ceremonial aspects of guild life served important functions in creating professional identity and maintaining group solidarity. Regular meetings, feast days, and religious observances brought members together for purposes that extended beyond mere business concerns. The guild maintained its own chapel, where members could worship together and seek divine blessing for their professional activities. These religious connections reflected the understanding that medical practice involved spiritual as well as physical dimensions of human welfare. The relationship between the Barber Surgeons Guild and other professional organizations was complex and sometimes competitive, reflecting overlapping jurisdictions and conflicting interests. University-trained physicians viewed barber surgeons as unqualified competitors who threatened their monopoly on medical practice. Apothecaries disputed guild members' rights to prepare and dispense medications. Simple barbers, who provided only grooming services, sometimes resented the medical activities that elevated their surgical colleagues above ordinary craft status. The geographic scope of guild influence varied significantly, depending on local political structures and economic conditions. Major commercial centers like London, Paris, and Bruges supported large, wealthy guilds that could influence municipal policies and maintain elaborate facilities. Smaller towns might have modest associations with limited resources, but similar functions in providing professional structure and mutual support. Rural practitioners often operated outside any formal guild system, relying on personal relationships and reputation to maintain their practices. The legal privileges associated with guild membership provided important protections for practitioners, while establishing their rights and responsibilities within medieval legal systems. Guild members enjoyed certain immunities from arbitrary taxation or prosecution, while gaining access to special courts that handled disputes related to professional practice. These privileges were balanced by obligations to maintain professional standards and submit to guild discipline when necessary. The educational functions of medieval guilds extended beyond basic apprenticeship training to include continuing education and professional development throughout members' careers. Regular meetings provided opportunities to discuss challenging cases, share new techniques, and debate changes in professional practice. Senior masters were expected to mentor junior colleagues and contribute to the accumulated wisdom of the profession. The decline of the guild system during the later medieval period reflected broader social and economic changes that transformed European society. The growth of centralized government, the development of formal licensing systems, and the increasing specialization of medical practice gradually undermined the functions that guilds had traditionally performed. However, the professional values and organizational principles that medieval guilds had developed continued to influence the evolution of medical practice long after the guild system itself had disappeared. The legacy of medieval guild organization can be seen in modern professional associations that continue to perform many of the same functions: establishing standards, providing mutual support, representing member interests, and maintaining professional identity. The oath that Thomas Whitmore took in 1485 established principles that continue to guide medical practice today, demonstrating the enduring relevance of medieval innovations in professional organization and ethical conduct. The morning of September 18th, 1745, marked the end of an era as the last official meeting of the United Company of Barber Surgeons convened in their historic London Hall. Master Edmund Hartwell, who had served the guild for over 40 years, gazed around the familiar chamber where countless professional disputes had been resolved, apprentices had taken their oaths, and the accumulated wisdom of generations had been preserved and transmitted. The royal decree that would formally separate the professions of surgery and barbering lay open before the assembled members, a document that would dissolve one of medieval Europe's most enduring professional organizations while establishing the foundation for modern medical practice. The forces that had driven toward this separation had been building for centuries, reflecting fundamental changes in medical knowledge, social expectations, and professional aspirations that made the traditional dual role increasingly untenable. The revolutionary work of practitioners like Ambroise Paré had demonstrated that surgery could be elevated from a crude craft to a sophisticated medical discipline worthy of university recognition and royal patronage. The growing complexity of surgical procedures had made specialization not only desirable, but necessary for maintaining competence in an expanding field of knowledge. The immediate catalyst for separation had come from successful barber surgeons themselves, who had grown frustrated with the limitations imposed by their traditional association with basic grooming services. Master Hartwell and his colleagues had spent decades developing surgical techniques that rivaled anything produced by university-trained physicians. Yet their social status remained constrained by their guild's historical connection to what was increasingly viewed as menial service work. The opportunity to establish surgery as an independent learned profession proved irresistible to ambitious practitioners who saw greater opportunities in specialization. The economic factors driving separation reflected changing market conditions that made specialization financially advantageous for both surgeons and barbers. Successful surgeons discovered that they could charge higher fees and attract wealthier clients by focusing exclusively on medical practice, while barbers found that grooming services remained profitable without the risks and liability associated with surgical procedures. This economic logic encouraged practitioners to specialize in areas where they could achieve the greatest expertise and financial return. The social dynamics surrounding separation revealed complex tensions within the profession as practitioners struggled to redefine their identities and relationships. Senior masters like Edmund Hartwell, who had built successful practices serving diverse clienteles, faced difficult decisions about whether to focus on surgery or return to basic barbering. Younger practitioners often embraced specialization as an opportunity for advancement, while established professionals worried about losing the flexibility that had made their careers successful. The educational implications of separation were profound, as the dissolution of traditional apprenticeship systems required new approaches to training specialized practitioners. Surgical education needed to become more sophisticated and formal to justify its claims to professional status, while barbering could continue to rely on traditional craft training methods. The establishment of formal surgical colleges and licensing systems created new pathways for professional advancement while setting higher standards for competence and conduct. The institutional changes accompanying separation reflected broader transformations in European society that were replacing medieval guild systems with modern professional organizations. The Royal College of Surgeons, established in 1800, represented a new model of professional organization that emphasized scientific knowledge, formal education, and regulatory authority, rather than the mutual aid and craft traditions that had characterized medieval guilds. This institutional transformation marked the definitive end of the medieval period in surgical practice. The symbolic aspects of separation were carefully negotiated to maintain connections with professional heritage, while establishing distinct identities for the emerging specialties. Surgeons retained many of the ceremonial elements that had marked their guild membership, including formal robes, ceremonial instruments, and ritual obligations that connected them with their professional ancestors. Barbers developed new symbols and traditions that emphasized their connection with grooming and cosmetic services rather than medical practice. The geographic variations in separation reflected different political and social conditions across European countries. France had led the way under Louis XV, completely prohibiting barbers from performing surgery in 1743. England's more gradual approach allowed for greater transition time and accommodation of existing practitioners. Other European regions implemented their own versions of separation that reflected local conditions and political arrangements. The impact on individual practitioners varied dramatically depending on their age, skill level, and client base. Master Edmund Hartwell, nearing retirement, chose to continue practicing both surgery and barbering under the grandfathering provisions that allowed established practitioners to maintain their traditional scope of practice. Younger guild members generally embraced specialization, with the most ambitious pursuing formal surgical education, while others focused on developing successful barbering businesses. The transformation of surgical education from apprenticeship to formal academic programs represented one of the most significant changes accompanying separation. The establishment of anatomical theaters, surgical demonstrations, and written examinations created new standards for professional competence while providing more systematic approaches to knowledge transmission. These educational innovations gradually improved the quality of surgical practice while establishing surgery as a legitimate academic discipline. The evolution of professional relationships following separation required careful negotiation of boundaries and responsibilities between surgeons, physicians, and barbers. Surgeons needed to establish their credentials as legitimate medical practitioners, while differentiating themselves from both university-trained physicians and traditional barbers. These professional boundary negotiations influenced the development of modern medical specialization and interprofessional relationships. The technological innovations that accompanied separation reflected the increasing sophistication of surgical practice and the resources that could be devoted to specialized equipment development. The establishment of dedicated surgical facilities allowed for improvements in instrumentation, lighting, and sanitation that had been impossible in traditional barber shops. These technological advances contributed to improved surgical outcomes while enhancing the professional prestige of specialized practice. The long-term consequences of separation extended far beyond the immediate changes in professional organization to encompass fundamental transformations in healthcare delivery and medical education. The specialization that began with the separation of surgery and barbering established precedents for the increasingly narrow professional focus that characterizes modern medical practice. The emphasis on formal education and scientific knowledge that accompanied surgical specialization contributed to the development of evidence-based medicine and research-oriented professional cultures. The preservation of historical memory surrounding the barber surgeon tradition has taken various forms that reflect continuing interest in this remarkable professional heritage. Museums, educational programs, and historical societies maintain collections and presentations that illustrate the tools, techniques, and social context of medieval surgical practice. Professional organizations continue to acknowledge their historical connections to barber surgeon traditions while emphasizing the evolution that has led to modern practice standards. The lessons that modern medical practitioners can derive from the barber surgeon tradition include insights into professional development, patient care, and the relationship between practical experience and theoretical knowledge. The empirical approach, pioneered by practitioners like Ambroise Paré, established principles of observation and evidence-based practice that continue to guide medical innovation. The emphasis on manual skill development and practical problem-solving that characterized barber surgeon training remains relevant for contemporary surgical education. The cultural impact of the barber surgeon tradition extends beyond professional medical practice to encompass broader themes in human history and social development. The transformation of humble craftsmen into essential medical practitioners demonstrates the potential for social mobility and professional evolution in response to changing societal needs. The integration of practical skill with compassionate patient care that characterized the best barber surgeons established ideals that continue to inspire healthcare providers today. As the last embers died in Master Edmund Hartwell's fireplace on that September evening in 1745, he carefully wrapped his surgical instruments for what he knew might be the final time. The tools that had served him for 4 decades, the razors honed to surgical sharpness, the fleams that had drawn countless quarts of blood, the forceps that had extracted hundreds of infected teeth, would soon become relics of a vanishing age. Outside his window, London continued its relentless growth toward becoming the modern metropolis that would define the industrial age. But within these walls, the ancient traditions of medieval barber surgery were drawing to their close. Yet even as one chapter ended, the legacy of the surgeon barber lived on in ways both obvious and subtle. The red and white pole that continued to mark barbershops throughout Europe carried forward the memory of blood and bandages, healing and hope. The emphasis on practical skill and empirical observation that had distinguished practitioners like Ambroise Paré became foundational principles of modern surgical education. The integration of technical competence with compassionate patient care that had marked the finest barber surgeons established ideals that continue to guide healthcare providers today. The story of the medieval barber surgeon reminds us that medical progress often comes from unexpected sources and that innovation frequently emerges from the intersection of necessity and human ingenuity. These remarkable practitioners, born from the humble necessity of monastic grooming, evolved to become the backbone of European medical care through sheer determination, practical wisdom, and an unwavering commitment to relieving human suffering. Their journey from monastery corridors to royal courts, from village squares to bloody battlefields, represents one of history's most dramatic professional transformations. In understanding their world, with its brutal procedures performed without anesthesia, its crude instruments maintained through daily ritual, its constant proximity to death and suffering. We gain insight not only into historical medical practice, but into the enduring human capacity for adaptation, innovation, and service to others. The medieval barber surgeon may have vanished into history, but their spirit of practical wisdom, empirical observation, and compassionate care continues to inspire those who follow in their footsteps, carrying forward the ancient tradition of healing. Through sharp instruments guided by steady hands and compassionate hearts,